My name is James, and I never thought I'd be sharing this story. But after what I experienced during my death, I realize I have no choice. I've wrestled with it, prayed about it, and even tried to push it aside, hoping someone else might step forward with a message like mine. Yet here I am, because some truths are too powerful to ignore, no matter how much you want to stay silent. It was an ordinary Thursday. I'd been working late, stuck finishing a project that seemed to drag on forever. By the time I clocked out, the parking lot was nearly empty, the rain falling in steady sheets under flickering streetlights. I called my wife to tell her I'd be home soon, her voice warm with relief that I was finally on my way. The kids were already asleep, but she promised to stay up. "Drive safe," she said, and I told her I would. The road was slick, and visibility was poor, but I knew every curve by heart. My thoughts drifted to how I'd surprise my wife with flowers this weekend. She deserved more than I gave her most days. More patience, more love, more time. I was so lost in thought I almost missed the oncoming headlights. They came fast, far too fast, the glare slicing through the darkness like a blade. My heart seized, my hands instinctively jerking the wheel. There was a screech of brakes, a horrible metallic crunch, and then nothing. No sound, no sensation, just a void. It wasn't like falling asleep. Falling asleep has a warmth to it, a gradual descent into unconsciousness. This was abrupt and absolute, yet somehow I knew I wasn't gone. I could still think, still be aware of myself, even though my body felt distant and irrelevant. And then I saw it. A light, impossibly bright but not blinding, pulling me toward it with a force I couldn't resist. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the eerie kind that makes your skin crawl, but a silence that wrapped around me like a blanket, soft and comforting. I felt weightless, as if every burden I'd ever carried had been stripped away. The light grew closer, and with it came a warmth that wasn't just physical. It was deeper, more profound. It was as though every cell in my being was absorbing pure love. I glanced down and saw my body lying crumpled in the twisted wreckage of my car. It should have horrified me, but it didn't. I felt detached, almost indifferent, like I was observing something that had nothing to do with me anymore. Then I heard it, a voice calm yet commanding, as though it could split mountains with a whisper. James. Just my name, but it resonated through me, carrying an undeniable authority. I turned toward the source, though it felt less like turning, and more like being drawn. What I saw defied description. A figure stood before me, radiant and majestic, with a presence that filled every corner of the space around us. His eyes held eternity, a depth so profound I felt I could drown in it. Though I hadn't seen him before, I knew without a doubt who he was. Every fiber of my soul trembled with recognition. "Lord?" I managed, though I wasn't sure if I spoke the word aloud or merely thought it. He didn't answer, not with words, but I felt his response within me. It was as if he said, "You are safe here," and for the first time, I understood what it meant to be completely at peace. He extended his hand, and as I reached for it, the world around us shifted. No longer were we surrounded by light. Instead, I saw a vast expanse of earth, stretched out before me like a living map. Mountains, rivers, cities, and forests shimmered with an ethereal glow. Yet there was a heaviness to the vision. "Look," he said, and this time, I heard the word clearly. His voice was filled with both sorrow and urgency. I followed his gaze, and saw people, millions of them, walking through their lives oblivious to what loomed above them. A shadow crept across the scene, vast and menacing. It wasn't a physical shadow, but something darker, a presence that seemed to siphon the light from everything it touched. The people didn't see it. They continued on, their eyes fixed on glowing screens, their hands clutching money, their hearts consumed by things that didn't matter. "Why don't they see it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They do not look," he replied simply, and there was a weight in his words that pressed against my soul. As I watched, the shadow grew, swallowing entire cities in its wake. People screamed, some fighting to escape, others too numb to resist. A few turned toward the light, their faces filled with desperation and hope. These were the ones who shone, like beacons, their faith piercing the darkness. "Even the faithful will be tested," he said, his tone both a warning and a promise. "The deception coming is greater than you can imagine." I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, the vision shifted again. I saw myself back in the world I had just left, holding a burden too heavy for one person to carry. I saw my family, my friends, and strangers I'd never met. I saw them looking to me, their eyes filled with questions I wasn't sure I could answer. "I can't do this," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm not enough." "You are not alone," he said, his voice gentle now. "I am with you always, but you must choose to act." The weight of his words settled in my chest, a mixture of comfort and responsibility. I wanted to stay there, in that place of light and love, but I felt myself being pulled away, the vision fading as reality closed in. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my body, pain coursing through me like fire. My wife's face hovered above mine, her tears falling onto my skin. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was cry. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. I could barely move, my body a patchwork of pain and bandages, but my mind raced. The weight of what I had seen and heard pressed against me, heavier than the injuries keeping me tethered to the bed. My wife sat beside me, her fingers wrapped tightly around mine, as though she feared I might slip away again. "You're going to be okay," she said softly, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. I wanted to tell her everything, to pour out the truth of where I'd been and what I'd seen, but I didn't know how. The words felt too fragile, too immense to form into anything coherent. Doctors came and went, their voices distant as they talked about surgeries, recovery plans, and physical therapy. None of it mattered. They were focused on my broken bones, but they didn't see the fracture inside me, the one that came from knowing a truth so monumental it threatened to tear me apart. It wasn't until the second night that I found the courage to speak. My wife had fallen asleep in the chair beside my bed, her hand still resting on mine, when I whispered, "I died." She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and for a moment she looked confused. "What did you say?" "I died," I repeated, my voice stronger this time. "And I came back." Her brow furrowed as she leaned closer, searching my face for some sign of what I meant. I took a shaky breath, my chest aching with the effort, and began to tell her everything. I spoke of the light, the voice, and the vision of the shadow creeping across the earth. I told her about the people blinded by their distractions, the faithful who shone like stars, and the warning I'd been given. Her expression shifted as I spoke, first disbelief, then fear, and finally something like awe. When I finished, she sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "James," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you really believe it was him? That you saw Jesus?" "I don't believe it," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I know it." The days that followed were a blur of hospital routines and quiet moments when my wife would sit beside me, holding my hand and asking questions I didn't always have answers for. How could I explain the depth of what I'd experienced? How could I put into words the overwhelming love and sorrow in his voice, the way his presence had filled me with both peace and urgency? When I was finally discharged, I returned home to a world that felt both familiar and alien. The mundane details of life, the bills, the errands, the noise of the news on the television, felt insignificant compared to the vision that haunted my thoughts. Yet I couldn't ignore them either. Part of the message I'd been given was clear. I wasn't meant to retreat from the world, but to engage with it, to be a voice crying out in the wilderness. But how? That question gnawed at me constantly. I wasn't a preacher or a prophet. I was just a man, a husband, a father, a guy who worked long hours and tried to keep his faith intact. What right did I have to stand up and proclaim something so extraordinary? I started small, confiding in a few close friends at church. Their reactions ranged from polite skepticism to quiet discomfort, as though they didn't quite know what to do with what I was telling them. A couple of them listened intently, nodding as I spoke, but even they seemed hesitant to fully believe. "Are you sure it wasn't just a dream?" one of them asked gently. "It wasn't a dream," I said firmly. "I know the difference. It was real." Despite their doubts, I kept trying. I spoke with my pastor, hoping for guidance, but even he seemed cautious, warning me to pray for discernment and avoid jumping to conclusions. "These things are complicated," he said. "Not every vision comes from God." His words planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't shake. What if I was wrong? What if I'd misunderstood? But every time I prayed, every time I reflected on the experience, the conviction in my heart grew stronger. This wasn't something I'd fabricated or imagined. It was a truth I had been entrusted with, and ignoring it felt like a betrayal, not just of him, but of myself. Then the signs began, small at first, almost imperceptible. News reports about advances in technology that seemed eerily similar to what I'd seen in the vision. Stories of division and unrest that mirrored the shadow's encroachment. I'd hear a snippet of a sermon or a conversation and feel the words resonate in a way that sent chills down my spine. One night, as I sat in the quiet of our living room, flipping through channels aimlessly, I stopped on a news segment about a new artificial intelligence program. The anchor spoke enthusiastically about its potential to revolutionize industries, but all I could hear was the warning in his voice. "The deception coming is greater than you can imagine." I turned off the TV and sat there in the dark, my hands trembling. It was happening. The shadow was growing just as he had shown me, and I was still sitting here, paralyzed by doubt and fear. I buried my face in my hands and prayed, not for guidance this time, but for courage. Courage to act, to speak, to carry the burden I'd been given, no matter the cost. That was the night I made my decision. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Whether people believed me or not, I had to share what I had seen. The stakes were too high to do anything else. The first time I spoke publicly about my experience, my voice trembled so much I could barely get the words out. It was a small gathering at our church, a midweek Bible study, where the group usually talked about scripture and shared prayer requests. I'd approached the pastor earlier that week, telling him I felt led to share something personal. He'd hesitated but eventually agreed, cautioning me to keep it brief and rooted in faith. As I stood in front of the group, my palms slick with sweat, I glanced at their faces, familiar, kind, but wary. These were people I'd known for years, yet in that moment they felt like strangers. I took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the lectern to steady myself. "Most of you know about my accident," I began, my voice cracking slightly. "What you don't know is what happened while I was gone." The room grew quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, expectant. I told them about the crash, the light, and the overwhelming love I'd felt in his presence. I described the vision of the shadow spreading across the world and the people who couldn't or wouldn't see it. My words came in fits and starts, halting and uneven, but I didn't stop. By the time I finished, my throat was dry and my hands were shaking. I looked out at the group, waiting for a response, but the silence stretched on uncomfortably. A few people nodded politely, others avoided eye contact altogether. Finally, an older woman named Margaret spoke up. "That's quite a story, James," she said, her tone cautious. "But how do you know it wasn't just your mind playing tricks on you? Near-death experiences can be complicated." "I know because it wasn't just something I saw," I replied, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "It was something I felt, something I still feel. This wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was real." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she didn't respond. Someone else murmured a quiet, non-committal, "Thank you for sharing." and the pastor quickly moved the discussion back to the evening scripture passage. I left that night feeling deflated, the weight of the vision heavier than ever. If even my church family couldn't believe me, how could I expect anyone else to? But as I sat in my car, staring out at the darkened parking lot, a thought came. To me, quiet but insistent. You weren't sent to convince them. You were sent to tell the truth. In the weeks that followed, I clung to that thought like a lifeline. It didn't matter if people believed me or not. My job wasn't to persuade, it was to be faithful to the message I'd been given. So I kept sharing little by little with anyone who would listen. Some conversations were easier than others. A coworker surprised me by leaning in after I shared my story over lunch, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I've always wondered about stuff like that," she said. "Do you think it means there's more to this life than what we see?" "Yes," I told her, my voice steady this time. "So much more." Other times the reactions were less encouraging. A neighbor I'd been friendly with for years gave me a tight smile and changed the subject when I mentioned the vision. Another friend outright laughed, though he quickly apologized when he saw the look on my face. But the hardest moments came when I saw the signs, the unmistakable echoes of the vision playing out in the world around me. It wasn't just the advancements in technology, though those were unsettling enough. It was the way people seemed to be growing colder, more divided, their hearts consumed by distractions and petty grievances. One afternoon, I stood in line at a coffee shop scrolling through headlines on my phone. Every story seemed worse than the last. Scandals, corruption, violence, greed. It was as if the shadow I'd seen in my vision was no longer creeping, but surging, and the light was struggling to break through. I thought about the people in my vision, the ones who had turned toward the light even as the darkness closed in. They were so few, so fragile compared to the vastness of the shadow. But their faith had shone like fire, piercing through the gloom. That's when I realized something I hadn't fully grasped before. The message wasn't just about warning people of the shadow's approach. It was about becoming one of those lights. It wasn't enough to share my story. I had to live it, to let my faith shine in a way that would inspire others to do the same. The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. I wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. I lost my temper too easily, let work consume me more than it should, and struggled with doubts like anyone else. But I knew now that perfection wasn't the point. Faith was. That night, as I knelt by my bed in prayer, I asked not for strength or clarity, but for the courage to keep going, even when it felt like I was speaking into a void. The answer came in a way I hadn't expected. Not as a voice or a vision, but as a quiet, unshakable resolve. I couldn't see where the path ahead would lead, but I knew I had to walk it. The shadow was growing, but so was the light. And I was determined to be a part of it, no matter how small my role might seem. The shift in my life wasn't sudden. It crept in like the sunrise, subtle but undeniable. I began to see everything through the lens of the vision. Every interaction, every decision, every fleeting moment. The mundane details of life felt imbued with new weight, as though I'd been handed a secret that transformed the ordinary into the sacred. But not everyone saw it that way. Conversations became trickier. The more I spoke about my experience, the more I noticed people pulling away. Some avoided me altogether, their polite smiles replaced with distant nods. Others, like my old friend Greg, felt the need to challenge me outright. "Do you even hear yourself?" he asked one night over dinner. "You sound like one of those doomsday preachers." "I'm not saying the world is ending," I replied carefully. "I'm saying there's a darkness growing and we need to be ready for it." "Ready how?" He waved a hand dismissively. "By clutching our Bibles and waiting for the sky to fall? It's not about fear," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "It's about faith, about keeping our eyes open and not letting ourselves get swept up in the lies." He shook his head, his expression a mix of frustration and pity. "You're a good guy, James, but this, whatever this is, it's not you. You've always been level-headed, practical. Don't let this..." He gestured vaguely, as if the whole idea was too absurd to articulate. Don't let it take over your life. But that was the thing. It had taken over my life, and there was no going back. Still, his words lingered, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Was I pushing too hard, alienating the very people I was trying to reach? Some nights I lay awake replaying conversations in my head, wishing I'd been gentler, more patient. But then I'd remember his voice, the urgency in it, and I'd feel the fire reignite. The signs continued, each one a thread pulling tighter around my chest. News of breakthroughs in artificial intelligence dominated the headlines, framed as marvels of innovation. Social media platforms rolled out features that promised to make life easier, but seemed to deepen the disconnect between people. One day I watched a report on a prototype that claimed to enhance decision-making by predicting human behavior. The anchor's cheerful tone clashed with the unease churning in my gut. The shadow wasn't just creeping anymore, it was weaving itself into the fabric of everyday life. I tried to focus on the light. I spent more time in prayer, more time with my family, and more time studying scripture. Passages I'd read 100 times before seemed to leap off the page, their meaning sharper, more urgent. One verse in particular haunted me. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. I couldn't shake the feeling that the deception I'd been warned about was closer than anyone realized. And then came the dream. It was different from the vision, not as vivid, not as consuming, but it felt significant all the same. I was standing in a vast, empty field under a sky that pulsed with unnatural light. In the distance, a towering figure loomed, its form shifting and indistinct. People flocked to it from every direction, their faces upturned in rapture. I tried to call out to them, to warn them, but no sound came from my throat. My feet felt rooted to the ground, immovable. The figure raised its arms and the light around it grew blinding. Then, just as suddenly, everything went dark. I woke with a start, my chest heaving, my heart pounding against my ribs. The room was silent, but the dream's images lingered, seared into my mind. That morning, as I sipped my coffee and tried to shake off the residual unease, I saw an article trending online. It was about a new AI program designed to simulate human empathy. The creators described it as the next step in human connection, capable of providing emotional support, guidance, even spiritual advice. The phrase false Christs echoed in my mind, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I knew I had to do more. Speaking one-on-one wasn't enough anymore. The message had to reach further, even if it meant stepping into the spotlight I'd been avoiding. That night, I sat down at my computer and began recording. My hands trembled as I adjusted the camera, but I pushed through the nerves. My name is James, I began, staring into the lens. And I need to tell you something that might sound impossible. But it's the truth. I poured everything into that video. Every detail of the vision, every warning, every piece of scripture that had burned in my heart since the day I returned. I didn't sugarcoat it, but I didn't try to scare people either. My goal wasn't to provoke fear, it was to ignite faith. When I finished, I uploaded the video and prayed. For courage, for wisdom, for anyone who might stumble across my story and see the truth in it. Days passed, then weeks. The video gained a trickle of views at first, then more as people began to share it. Comments flooded in, some supportive, others skeptical, and a few outright hostile. But then there were messages, quiet and heartfelt, from people who said the video had resonated with them. People who had felt the same unease, who had seen signs of the shadow in their own lives. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't since the moment I woke up in that hospital bed. Hope. Maybe I wasn't alone in this after all. Maybe the light was stronger than I'd realized. The momentum from the video was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every morning I woke up to new comments and messages, some filled with gratitude, others dripping with disdain. People debated fervently. in the threads dissecting every word I'd spoken. "You're a false prophet," one comment read. "Stop trying to scare people into your cult." Another said, "I've had dreams like yours. You're not crazy. The deception is real." It was a cacophony of voices, supportive, doubtful, angry, hopeful. For every person who dismissed me as delusional, there was another who seemed genuinely moved, inspired to think deeper about their faith or the state of the world. But as the reach of the message grew, so did the challenges. My work life began to suffer as I found myself distracted, consumed by the urgency of spreading the truth. My boss pulled me aside one day, his expression tight. "James," he said, "you've been a great employee for years, but lately, your focus just isn't there. Is everything okay?" I wanted to explain, to tell him everything, but I knew it wouldn't go over well. So I just nodded, muttered an apology, and promised to do better. At home, things weren't much easier. My wife, Sarah, had been supportive in the beginning, but even her patience was wearing thin. "I miss you," she said one night as we sat on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background. "You're here, but you're not here. You're always on your phone responding to messages or reading articles about AI and end times prophecy." "I'm doing this for us," I said, the words sounding defensive even to my own ears. "For the kids. Don't you see what's happening in the world? If we don't prepare—" "I get it, James," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "I really do. But you're so focused on saving everyone else that you're forgetting about the people who need you the most. We need you." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. I looked at her, at the tears pooling in her eyes, and realized how far I'd let things spiral. The vision had consumed me, yes, but it had also isolated me. I'd been so caught up in the urgency of the message that I'd neglected the very relationships that mattered most. That night I stayed up long after Sarah had gone to bed, staring out the window into the darkness. I prayed for guidance, for balance, for a way to fulfill my purpose without losing myself or my family in the process. The answer didn't come immediately, but over the next few weeks I began to see a way forward. I started setting boundaries, carving out dedicated time for Sarah and the kids. I made a point to leave my phone in another room during family dinners and to really listen when Sarah spoke. It wasn't easy. The weight of the vision still pressed heavily on me, and the world around us only seemed to grow darker. News reports of unrest, corruption, and technological breakthroughs came at a relentless pace, each one a reminder of the shadow's advance. But in the midst of it all, I found moments of light. One evening, as I was tucking my daughter Lily into bed, she looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. "Daddy, why do you talk about Jesus so much?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because he's the light, sweetheart. He's the one who shows us the way when everything else feels dark." She seemed to think about that for a moment, then nodded. "Okay," she said simply, her small hand reaching out to grab mine. "Can you pray with me?" My throat tightened, and I had to blink back tears as I knelt beside her bed. In that moment, the enormity of the vision seemed to shrink, replaced by the simple, profound truth of what really mattered. The days that followed brought more challenges, but they also brought clarity. I realized that the vision wasn't just about warning people. It was about living a life that reflected the light, about being a beacon of hope in a world increasingly consumed by shadows. I began focusing my efforts more intentionally, creating videos and blog posts that encouraged people to strengthen their faith, to build connections within their communities, and to seek the truth in their own lives. The feedback was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people around the world, some sharing their own experiences, others asking how they could prepare for what was to come. And yet, despite the growing impact, I still struggled with moments of doubt. Was I doing enough? Was I even making a difference? One particularly difficult night, I found myself alone in the living room, staring at the flickering glow of the fireplace. I whispered a prayer into the quiet, asking for reassurance, for some sign that I was on the right path. The answer came, not in a voice or a vision, but in a memory, a flash of the guiding figure I'd encountered during the NDE. His words echoing in my mind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It wasn't a guarantee of success, but it was a promise. The light would endure. The truth would prevail. And in that moment I knew, as long as I kept walking in faith, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Life became a strange balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary. On the surface, I was still James, husband, father, and a man trying to make sense of the chaos in the world. But beneath that, there was an undercurrent of purpose that hummed through everything I did. Every conversation, every choice, every quiet moment of prayer felt like it carried the weight of eternity. The world outside my small bubble seemed to tilt further into the uncanny. News reports grew more surreal by the week, AI programs becoming indistinguishable from human thought, technology embedding itself into every corner of daily life, and a steady stream of promises that innovation would solve all of humanity's problems. It wasn't just the technology, though. People were changing. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as paranoia. But the more I paid attention, the clearer it became. Kindness felt rarer, patience thinner. It was as if something unseen was amplifying division and eroding compassion. One Sunday morning, our pastor gave a sermon about the armor of God, quoting Ephesians, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness." As he spoke, I felt the words settle over me like a mantle, heavy but reassuring. After the service, I lingered in the sanctuary, my hands clasped tightly as I stared up at the cross. The church had emptied out, but I stayed, needing the silence to process. The pastor approached me quietly, his footsteps soft on the worn carpet. "James," he said, his voice gentle, "you've been carrying something heavy lately. Want to talk about it?" For a moment, I hesitated. It was one thing to share my experience with strangers online, but to tell someone face to face, to risk seeing doubt, or worse, pity, in their eyes. But something about his demeanor encouraged me, and before I knew it, the words came spilling out. I told him everything: the accident, the vision, the figure, the warning, and the unshakable sense of urgency that had followed me ever since. When I finished, he didn't speak right away. He just sat with me in the silence, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he said, "I believe you." Relief washed over me, so powerful it left me momentarily lightheaded. "You're not alone. In this," he continued, "the enemy wants us to feel isolated, like our battles are ours to fight alone. But that's not how God designed us. We're meant to stand together." His words stayed with me long after I left the church. That week, I started reaching out to others, not just online, but in person. I organized a small group of like-minded individuals, people who had seen the signs and felt the same unease about the direction the world was heading. We began meeting weekly, sharing our thoughts, our prayers, and our fears. It was humbling to realize how many others had been carrying similar burdens, each of us afraid to speak out for fear of being labeled paranoid or fanatical. One evening during one of our gatherings, a woman named Clara shared a dream she'd had. In it, she was standing at the edge of a vast chasm, watching as people marched toward it in a trance-like state. She tried to warn them, to pull them back, but they couldn't hear her. The only thing that stopped them was a beam of light that appeared, cutting through the darkness and breaking their spell. Her description sent chills down my spine. It echoed so much of what I'd seen and felt during my own experience. "Maybe that's our role," I said, my voice trembling. "To be that light, to break the spell." The group nodded in agreement, their faces solemn but determined. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope, a sense that, together, we might be able to push back against the shadow. But the challenges didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. One night, as I scrolled through messages, I came across one that stood out. It was from an anonymous account, the text brief but unsettling. "You're drawing attention. Be careful." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Who had sent it? And what did they mean by attention? The days that followed, strange things began happening. My email was flooded with spam, and my phone started glitching in ways I couldn't explain. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence, but when my home Wi-Fi was hacked and all my passwords were reset, I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone or something was trying to silence me. Fear crept in, threatening to choke the resolve I'd worked so hard to build, but I refused to let it win. One night, as I prayed for strength, a memory of the figure's words came rushing back. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I clung to that promise, repeating it like a mantra as I continued my work. If the enemy wanted me to stop, it only meant the message was reaching the right people. The weeks that followed were a blur of challenges and triumphs. More people joined our group, sharing their own stories and visions. The online response to my videos grew, with viewers from around the world reaching out to say they felt the same urgency, the same call to prepare. And yet, even in the midst of progress, the shadow loomed ever closer. One night, while scrolling through the news, I saw a report about a new initiative, a global network designed to unify humanity under a single, digital system. The program's name was innocuous, almost friendly, but the implications were anything but. My heart sank as I read the details, each word confirming what I already knew. The deception was unfolding, and the time to act was growing shorter. But as I closed my laptop, a quiet determination settled over me. The vision had been clear. The light would prevail, but only if we refused to be silent. And so, with every ounce of faith I had, I resolved to keep going, to speak the truth, to stand against the shadow and to shine the light, no matter the cost. The days bled into weeks, and though the world around me continued to spin, I couldn't shake the weight of what was coming. Every interaction, every news story, every shift in technology seemed to whisper of the inevitability of the vision. As I sat with my family, I often found myself distracted, my mind racing with the urgency of the message I'd been given. I had become obsessed, the fear of what lay ahead gnawing at me. Yet in those quiet moments with Sarah and the kids, I saw a glimmer of hope. The very hope I was trying to preserve for the world, it was still there in the people closest to me. But even that hope was beginning to feel fragile. The constant barrage of information and the rising tension in society wore at my spirit. I tried to hold on to the lessons of the vision, to the reassurance that the light would shine in the darkness. Yet each time I looked around, the darkness seemed to creep ever closer. One evening, Sarah and I sat in the living room, her hand resting on mine. The kids had gone to bed and the house was quiet. I looked at her, unsure of how to express the turmoil within me. "Sarah, do you ever feel like something's coming? Like we're on the edge of something we can't stop?" She squeezed my hand, her voice soft but steady. "I've been feeling it too, James. I've seen the way you've changed. I know you're doing everything you can to prepare, but you've got to remember you're not in this alone." Her words were a balm, soothing the raw edges of my anxiety. But as comforting as they were, I still couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The next day, as I went about my daily tasks, my phone buzzed with an urgent notification. I had a new message, this one marked with a sense of urgency that made my stomach churn. It was from a person I didn't recognize, but the message was clear. "They know what you're doing. You're being watched. Be careful." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Who was this? And what did they mean? The walls seemed to close in around me as I reread the message, my thoughts racing. I had to act fast. I couldn't risk my family's safety, not when they were already under so much strain. I quickly deleted the message, but the sense of being watched never left. The next few days were a blur of fear and uncertainty. My online presence grew, but so did the tension. People from all corners of the world reached out, some with gratitude, others with fury. But the most unsettling thing was the rise in online threats, strange accounts messaging me with cryptic warnings. I tried to stay focused on the mission, but the doubt crept in. Was I doing more harm than good? Was the truth I was sharing too dangerous? Would it all come crashing down? Late one night, as I sat at my desk exhausted from the weight of it all, I felt a presence. It wasn't physical, but it was undeniable. My heart skipped a beat as I looked around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one. Then in my mind, I heard it. A voice, soft but unmistakable, like the echo of the guiding figure from my vision. "You were not meant to walk this path alone." I froze, the words sinking deep into my soul. A profound sense of peace washed over me, and for the first time in days, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't alone. The next morning, as I sat in prayer, the world seemed quieter, as if the storm in my mind had finally calmed. It was then that I realized the truth. My fear wasn't just about the end of the world. It was about losing the people I loved in the process. I had spent so much time preparing for a battle that I had neglected to love and protect those closest to me. I had been so focused on the truth I had seen that I had forgotten to live it. With renewed clarity, I returned to the work I had started. But now I moved forward with a sense of balance. I made sure to spend more time with Sarah and the kids, to listen more deeply, and to show them the light that I had been so consumed with sharing with the world. The urgency didn't disappear, but I learned to carry it with grace, with the understanding that my mission didn't have to come at the cost of my humanity. In the weeks that followed, the world seemed to continue its relentless march forward. The darkness still loomed, but I saw it in a new light. It wasn't just a threat that I needed to fight, it was a test, one that I couldn't face alone. The message I had been given wasn't just for the world. It was for me, for my family, for every person who felt lost in the chaos. The light was still there, waiting for us to reach out and embrace it. I still don't know what the future holds, but I know this: we cannot face the darkness alone. It's a battle that requires all of us to come together, to stand firm in the truth, and to shine the light in every corner of our lives. There is no time to waste. The days grow shorter, but as long as we remain vigilant, as long as we remain united in faith, the light will not falter, and neither will we. The journey, however, was far from over. If anything, the challenges ahead only seemed to grow. The peace I had briefly felt began to fade, replaced by the reality that the world was rapidly becoming a place where the truth felt more dangerous than the lie. Every day I read about new technological advancements, more integration of AI into everyday life, and the increasing centralization of power into the hands of a few. It was as if the very things I had been warned about were beginning to manifest. I was not imagining it anymore. What I had seen during my near-death experience was no longer just a vision. It was becoming real. One evening, as I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking over some of the messages that had come in from people around the world, Sarah entered, her face etched with concern. She had been quieter than usual lately, and I knew that my obsession with spreading the message was starting to take its toll on her as well. "James," she said softly, sitting down beside me, "you've been talking about the future a lot. But we're still here. You need to take care of yourself. Take care of us." I looked at her, the weight of her words sinking deep into me. I had become consumed by the urgency of it all. I thought I was doing the right thing, trying to warn others, but somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of what really mattered: my family. She was right. I was so focused on fighting the darkness that I'd neglected to truly be present in the light. I took a deep breath and reached for her hand. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I've been so wrapped up in this. I don't want to be the one who ignored the signs. I can't sit by and let everything fall apart without doing something." "I know," she said, squeezing my hand. "But the message you're carrying doesn't have to destroy. It's in the process. We can fight it together, but we need to take care of each other too." Her words hit me like a jolt of electricity. For the first time in a long while, I understood what I had to do. The battle wasn't just about fighting the world's systems, the dark forces that seemed to be growing in power. It was about protecting the people I loved. It was about building a future where the light of truth and love could thrive, despite everything that was happening around us. The next few days I worked to strike a balance, I still reached out to people, still shared the message I had been entrusted with, but I also made sure to spend more time with Sarah and the kids. I took more walks with them in the evenings, talked to them about their hopes and dreams, and reminded them that they were not alone. The more I did this, the more the weight on my shoulders lightened, but the sense of urgency never fully left. The world was changing rapidly, and the systems of control were becoming more sophisticated. By the day, the warnings I had received, the visions of a world where truth was hidden behind layers of deception, were becoming too clear to ignore. The light, the very truth that had been shown to me, was still under threat. Then, one afternoon, a message arrived that shook me to my core. It was from someone I hadn't heard from in months, a friend I had made during my early research. The subject line read, "They're coming for you." I opened it with trembling hands. "James, I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. They've been monitoring everything I do, my phone, my computer, my every move. I've seen them, the agents. They're real, and they're everywhere. You're not safe. Be careful. I'm sorry, but I can't help you anymore. The darkness is too big now." The message ended abruptly, and my heart raced in my chest. What did this mean? Were the powers I had seen in my vision really coming for me? Was I about to be silenced, just like the countless others who had tried to speak out before me? I closed my eyes, the weight of it all crashing down on me. But then, through the darkness, a thought flickered in my mind, a memory of the voice I had heard during my near-death experience, the voice that had filled me with strength and peace. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I breathed deeply, drawing strength from the truth I had been given. The world might be closing in, but I wasn't going to back down. I had a purpose, and I wasn't going to let fear stop me from fulfilling it. As I sat there, the realization struck me. The message I carried was more than just words. It was a call to action. It was a challenge to stand firm in the truth, even when the world tried to tear it down. The battle had always been more than just external forces. It was a battle within. The darkness that threatened to consume everything wasn't just a force outside of us. It was also within us, in the choices we made, the compromises we allowed, and the truths we ignored. The enemy, I had learned, was not some faceless villain. It was the apathy, the fear, the willingness to accept lies because the truth was too uncomfortable. It was in every decision we made to turn away from what was right, to hide from the light rather than embrace it. I stood up from my desk, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would not be easy, and I couldn't fight it alone, but I knew what I had to do. The time had come for me to face the darkness, both outside and within, and to fight for the light, no matter the cost. As I walked to the door, I glanced back at the family photos on the wall, Sarah and the kids smiling, full of life. They were my anchor, my reason for everything. I would protect them, I would protect all of us, and I would not let the darkness win. The days stretched on, filled with an urgency that had become familiar, yet never quite comfortable. It was as if time itself had accelerated, rushing toward an unknown destination. The messages, the warnings, the threats, they all seemed to converge into a single, unavoidable truth. I was on the precipice of something much larger than myself. No matter how many times I questioned it, no matter how many times I tried to rationalize my own fears, the clarity of the vision I had experienced during my near-death encounter was undeniable. The light was real, and so was the darkness. I continued my mission, speaking to anyone who would listen, sharing the message that had been entrusted to me. But something had shifted. The further I went, the more I realized that this battle wasn't just about exposing some grand conspiracy or warning against future technology. It was a battle for the very soul of humanity. And in a strange twist, I had become a symbol, a person people turned to when they felt lost or hopeless. It was a responsibility I never asked for, yet one I could no longer ignore. One evening, while I sat with Sarah trying to make sense of it all, she finally spoke what had been on both of our minds for weeks. "James, we can't keep doing this. You've taken on too much. You're going to burn yourself out. And what about the kids? They need you too." Her voice was laced with concern, but also love, and I knew she was right. I had pushed myself beyond what was sustainable, consumed by the urgency of the mission, driven by the fear of what was coming. But in doing so, I had neglected the very people who depended on me. "I know, Sarah. I don't know how to stop. I can't ignore what I've seen. It's like a fire inside me that won't go out," I confessed, my voice tinged with exhaustion. "But I don't want to lose you or the kids. You all mean everything to me." She smiled softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "You won't lose us, James. But you have to learn to find balance. The fight is important, yes, but so is the love we share. You can't let the darkness consume you, not when you've already seen the light." Her words struck a chord deep within me, reverberating in my soul. It was true. The light I had encountered in that moment of death, the peace and love that had transcended all fear, was still here, still within me. And if I truly believed in the power of that light, I had to trust that it would guide me, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. That night, I went to bed with a newfound sense of clarity. The weight of the world's problems hadn't vanished, but I knew now that I didn't have to carry it all alone. I had my family, my faith, and the knowledge that the light was always within reach. It was in every act of kindness, every moment of connection, every time we chose to love instead of fear. The darkness could never extinguish the light unless we allowed it. The next morning, I sat down with Sarah and the kids, and for the first time in weeks, I truly listened to them. We talked about their dreams, their hopes for the future, and I reminded them that no matter what happened, we would face it together. We were stronger than the fear that tried to tear us apart. I knew the road ahead would still be difficult, that the darkness was far from vanquished. But I also knew that I wasn't alone in the fight. I had a family that stood by me, a faith that grounded me, and the light of truth that would guide my every step. The world might try to drown us in noise, in fear, in confusion, but the light, our light, would always shine through. And as long as we held on to it, we could face whatever came next. I stood by the window that morning, looking out over the horizon. There was a storm on the way, but the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting rays of light across the land. It was a reminder, a promise, that no matter how dark the world became, the light would always find a way to shine through. And so I carried on. With every breath, with every step, I embraced the truth that had been shown to me. The message, the warning, the truth, I would share it, yes, but I would also live it. For in the end, the light was not just something we had to fight for, it was something we had to become. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. The journey was far from over, and as long as I had the strength to walk it, I would never stop shining that light. For if there was one thing I had learned in my near-death experience, it was this: darkness could never extinguish the light. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear. The light we carry within us is stronger than we realize, and together we can keep it shining, no matter how dark the world becomes.